Greetings, hello and welcome to this fireside chat of the Toronto Global Forum. My name is Mike Frith and I am the Chief Economist of the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. Today I'm talking to Matt Winneray, CEO of the Super Fund, my boss, on financial sustainability and achieving a sustainable recovery post-COVID, particularly focusing on the Super Fund's experiences and objectives in this most important field. G'day, Matt.
Sure, Mike. Thank you.
Now, Matt and I would see each other fairly regularly in the office, but at the moment we're both at home. Auckland, where we reside, has been in partial lockdown for 3 months now in response to COVID in the community, and that might be a surprise to some of you out there. Perhaps, Matt, to get the discussion underway, you'd be able to give us an account of New Zealand's experience with COVID-19 over the past 18 months or so.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. And those of you up in Toronto, you'll have to forgive us for not having the fire blazing behind us. We are just coming into summer down here in the Southern Hemisphere, so we're looking forward to being able to get out into that. So the COVID for us to date has been a bit of a game of two halves. So first half, really, from the start of last year through to the middle of this one, we started with a sharp lockdown and an elimination strategy. And what's been a bit of a hindrance to us in the past, perhaps what we call the tyranny of distance, our isolation as a country, has certainly helped us in that. And that elimination strategy with the closed borders enabled us to eliminate COVID transmission in the community and then largely reopen the economy as normal, having been able to eliminate transmission. Of course, with the caveat of big sectors like tourism and international education, which clearly were significantly and continue to be significantly affected. We were able to open up fiscal and monetary support for businesses, so wage subsidies, business support payments, increased benefits, lower interest rates, to support the economy and replace some of that diminished demand that we suffered. And the economy through that 18 months did pretty well. And that's because we were able to have, as a result of that elimination, some of the least stringent restrictions globally in terms of COVID restrictions. We started from a good position in terms of the fiscal position. We had pretty low government debt, which enabled the government to be able to open those taps and support the economy. And as a result, we printed a pretty reasonable growth number in the year to June 2021, and that was all the first half. The second half, which has been the Delta half, from sort of the middle of this year, we watched Delta move around the world and then ultimately turn up here, and that really challenged that elimination strategy. We weren't able, despite a sharp lockdown in the whole country very quickly, able to eliminate that community transmission, and now about half the country remains in reasonably stringent lockdown. So that's Auckland, the biggest city where you and I are, Mike, and the surrounding areas. As a result, we've seen some of our economic indicators start to turn. Obviously, consumer confidence is taken a hit. We're starting to see inflation come through. We've printed the biggest inflation number we've seen for a number of years. Relatively recently, we've seen impacts on supply chains. And we've also seen in the second half the impact of that looser monetary policy, so lower rates and higher savings, really pop out in the form of a very strong housing market. So making a market that was pretty unaffordable before the pandemic become seriously unaffordable following a significant run up in housing prices. On the other side, we just printed the lowest unemployment rate we've seen in a number of years as well, so down in the 3% range. So businesses are finding it hard to find workers. We are also feeling that at the Super Fund in terms of Historically, we've been able to get people from overseas, and that certainly has been shut off as the borders are closed. So the outlook for us, some parts of the economy are doing pretty well. Some of them are clearly struggling still, tourism and the like. The suppression strategy that we've now moved into focuses on the vaccination rate. We're targeting 90% double vaxxed in the 12 and over part of the population. We're currently in the high 80s in terms of single dose and mid 70s in terms of double dose, aiming to get there by pretty much the end of this year, which would see us be able to open up the economy and then start to relax the border. But how that plays out depends very much on how fast we can get to that vaccination level now that we have COVID transmission in the community and we're unable to eliminate it.
Yeah, and I think people will be interested to hear how challenges have evolved over time. But and clearly locally and globally, the pandemic has been a clear focus on the pandemic, and rightly so. It's had massive impacts on people and people's lives. But it's really not the only crisis that we've got confronting us. In fact, we've had crises confronting us for some time. Climate change, biodiversity. I guess in 10 years' time, if we look back in the rear vision mirror, hopefully COVID's a distant memory, the decisions we make now or have been making will be critical around climate change. So I guess, how do you think we at the super fund or closer to home or even globally have evolved their perceptions and their targets between the pandemic, the right urgent, and the broadly more important climate change and biodiversity issues?
Yeah, well, I got an interesting lens on this because at the start of last year, I was co-chairing the New Zealand Sustainable Finance Forum, and that was an initiative where a bunch of public and private market participants came together to develop a plan to set us on a path to a sustainable financial system by the end of this decade. And so it's similar to a lot of international initiatives. The Canadian expert panel on sustainable finance was one that was running slightly ahead of us. And so we were able to take advantage of some of the great work that panel did, as well as other sustainable finance initiatives around the world. And what was interesting is, as we'd been working through that in 2019, climate had been obviously a massive focus. But as the pandemic hit, and people started to focus on social outcomes more and resilience of businesses and things like, what's the sick leave policy of a business and how's that impacting the ultimate resilience of that business and the ability for it to reach the long term. We saw a shift in that conversation. So sustainability became a little bit less at that point around just climate and a lot more discussion about, well, how do we think about the S? Because the S can be quite a challenge. There's lots of different social priorities and social outcomes. They're harder to measure. It's harder to find causation. But the S became really important because that resilience became so important. The idea that you've got some sort of long-term destination is great, but if you can't survive the journey, then the destination doesn't matter. So we saw a big increase in as a result of the pandemic in that discussion around social. But you're quite right. At the same time, while we're all focusing on what's right in front of us, these other things are still going. Climate change's impact is getting worse. Biodiversity is ignored as much as it was before the pandemic, and is increasingly in peril as well. So the way that we, I guess, have been looking at that is to say that in that sustainable finance forum, how do we change the way decisions are made so that financial decisions take into account the long-term real-world impacts of those decisions? And that's really what the sustainable finance approach is. How do we get those decision changes along all through the financial system? So not just investors or asset owners like us, but investment managers and banks and regulators and governments. How do we change the way in which those decisions are made to make sure that they incorporate those long-term outcomes? And actually, the pandemic was a really useful trigger for a lot of that conversation in the Sustainable Finance Forum.
Yeah, it's a good point about how we're now, what sort of lessons or learnings we can take from our approach to COVID-19 into some of those other challenges that we're facing, in particular, that we can come up with solutions if we really put our mind to it. Or I guess there's the challenges around getting coordinated responses, where some countries still have maybe their own objectives and targets that may not line up with the best global response.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what was encouraging about the response to COVID was, with an immediate, urgent issue in front of us, we saw, certainly at the national level, really quite good coordination in terms of the response, and even from an international level, certainly around the production of vaccines, a pretty good degree of collaboration there. Although some might say that the distribution of those things is shown where that can break down, and where sort of self-interest can overpower that need to achieve a collective outcome. But what? Yeah, so we're encouraged by, what can a nation do when presented with a real and immediate threat in terms of the collective response. And in New Zealand, we saw that in that lockdown. We had really good compliance in that first lockdown, and we saw the benefit of that, where we managed to eliminate community transition and transmission, and then we were all able to, pretty much return to life as normal, subject to not being able to hop on a plane and go to Australia or Fiji or US or wherever. So with some restrictions, we definitely saw that benefit. And so the analogy was, well, if we can do that, then with the immediate and urgent need to respond to, in particular, climate change, which is clearly topical given COP26 going on at the moment, how do we get the collaboration there? Because the same thing is relevant. You can't. We're not all able to live without COVID until we're all without COVID. Until we've all been, until the whole world. It's a fantasy to think that one country can protect itself while COVID is raging. And what we saw was, the economy can't operate while a virus is rampant. Whether that's because government puts restrictions on, or people just self-restrict. So, and the analogy is quite clear that the planet can't operate while the climate is rampant. So the response to climate change has to be a global collaboration, most obviously by actually pricing the externality, which is the free pass that people are getting to release carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That type of collaboration, which is going on in COP26 at the moment, is hard. But we saw, but you got some optimism about the ability to do it if it's immediate. The challenge with climate change, of course, is that the benefits of those things will happen over time and will happen across national boundaries. Even though we all suffer when greenhouse gases are released, in another country, it still is going to affect our temperature. But there was a degree of optimism in terms of being able to see that collaboration and perhaps translate that into some of these other nutty, really gnarly questions that we're trying to deal with.
So maybe then it's now an opportune time to pivot into what actually the Super Fund has been doing, both through its own portfolio and its own initiatives, but also recognising, the Super Fund is not a humongous, massive player in global markets. So also some of the initiatives that we're involved with, trying to build a bigger underlying or groundswell of action.
Yeah. So very quickly, just for the audience who won't know who we are, the Super Fund was set up by a piece of legislation 20 years ago. We've just had our 20th birthday since then. And we're set up to smooth out the increasing cost of the universal pension that all New Zealanders get when they turn 65. Like plenty of other developed countries, we've got an aging population, and so we're going to have more retirees and fewer taxpayers to fund that universal pension. So we were set up put some money aside, grow that, and start smoothing out that cost. So we're here to sort of shift. We're an intergenerational sort of pre-funded super scheme. What have we been doing? Well, the course of the last year, while we've sometimes been in lockdown and sometimes not, we've been having a discussion with our board about where do we take our responsible investment approach, and that's where this whole sustainable finance conversation has been really helpful, because essentially we've taken our approach from responsible investment to sustainable finance, and that may sound a little bit semantic and not particularly meaningful, but it's a pretty important change. What it means is responsible investment you might think of as, well, I need to think about the impact of these long-term trends like climate change or social outcomes on my investments. What's the impact on my investments or on my business? Sustainable finance asks that question, so what's the impact on our investments and on our business, but also asks, what's the impact of my investments on those outcomes? What's the impact of my investment portfolio on climate change? What's the impact of my investment portfolio on other social outcomes, such as you might measure under the Sustainable Development Goals? And that shift has been quite marked, and we've seen that happening globally. In the course of that work on that transition, we've done a pretty good scan of where the world has gone in terms of trends in responsible investment and sustainable finance, and we think that best practice is now that sustainable finance space. So we've been pretty focused on updating, if you like, our approach to how we incorporate these issues into our investment decision making. And I think one of the best ways of expressing that at COP26, I heard Mark Carney recently talk about the approach there. Basically, the mantra for COP26 from an investment world, from a financial world, is that every financial decision needs to take climate change into account. And actually, when you express it like that, sounds pretty simple.
And so you've talked about our shift from responsible investment to sustainable finance. We've done a fair bit in the climate change space. We've got quite a significant climate change strategy underway. Perhaps you could just explain a little bit about how that's evolving, and also just some of those I guess connections that we're making or engagement across the broader global environment.
Sure. So I'll talk a bit about the climate change strategy first, and then obviously we've done a bit of collaboration on that front as well. So our climate change strategy, we kicked off 5 years ago. We announced 5 years ago, but we've been on this climate journey for the last decade, participating in CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. We're founder signatories of the PRI. We teamed up with a bunch of other investors to get Mercer to produce a bit of work for us back in 2014 about the impact of climate change on long-term investor returns. And so we've been working on that for a while. That involved reducing our exposure to high emission companies and fossil fuel reserves. It also involved analysing or incorporating climate change questions into our investment decision making, engaging in voting, so engaging with companies to change the real world outcomes, not just our portfolio outcomes, and finally investing in solutions. And we've been operating that for 4 years from a portfolio construction perspective, and we've increased the ambition of our carbon reduction targets along the way. But most recently, we've pushed that along a step further by committing to a net zero, the net zero asset owners commitment, so Paris aligned investment initiative. And that sees us commit to a net zero portfolio by 2050. And we're doing that with a bunch of other investors around the world. We've done quite a bit of work in the One Planet Sovereign Wealth Fund Forum to bring sovereign wealth funds together to lift our capability across the board in terms of how we're responding to climate change and share our experiences and our our challenges, and there are plenty of challenges. We've also joined a number of other initiatives, Climate Action 100 Plus, the Transition Pathway Initiative, and more recently, Sustainable Markets Initiative, which is one that Prince Charles is heading up and is doing a fair bit of work at COP26 at the moment. And what that is looking at is how practically, the bit that we're involved in is, how do you deal with this from an asset allocation perspective? How do you think about climate change and incorporate it into the portfolio? So yeah, a lot of work. It's been a journey. We've most recently, the next step is that net zero commitment, and that's going to see us have to publish a report within the next year, which will detail how we're going to get there. So you got to step away from this. We're going to make big pledges and grand gestures, and actually get into this. So what decision is going to be different? What changes as a result of that commitment? When I'm thinking about the longer term outcomes on some of these sustainable development goals, what does that mean in terms of where I allocate capital, or which manager I choose, or which asset or which security I buy? That's where it has to get to, is the change. What decisions have been changed?
And I guess part of that strategy, we've taken some of the carbon exposure out of the portfolio. We've tried to get an understanding of what is our carbon footprint. I mean, those are really, they sound like quite simple steps, but they're actually critical in terms of what our exposure actually is. But I guess now we're moving into, and a lot of asset owners are now moving into, what can we actually buy? Or how can we actually allocate to good things, not just selling bad things to other people? Where's that thinking currently lined up?
Yeah, that's totally right, because there's some things that investors can do. There's three levers that you can do to decarbonise your portfolio. One is you sell some things that are heavy carbon. Two is you engage with those companies to reduce their exposures. And the third is you start investing in things that actively help the solution, so reduce carbon or zero carbon neutral, for example, generation. So those three things you will do will have different impacts. Actually, the PRI announced its most recent 3-year strategy just recently, and the strap line for that is building a bridge between financial risk and real world outcomes. And I think that's a really important bit. So we sort of stop. We continue to think about our portfolio, what's the risk that we carry, but we're also thinking about how do we allocate to solutions. And that's what historically is called positive investment or impact investment. And that can cover not just climate solutions, but also social solutions. So it's an important part of, as we come out of this COVID recovery, and there's a massive amount of spending going on around the world from governments, but also investors looking for opportunities. How do we allocate that capital in a way which produces what we think is important in positive investment, which is intentionality. So you meaning to have an outcome which is both a positive social outcome or environmental outcome, and a financial return, and additionality. So you haven't just invested in something that's already doing something good. That capital is going to encourage some additional benefit. So we're focused on that positive investment space, and we're talking to investors around the world who are really doing some significant allocations of capital to that positive investment, because that changes real world outcomes, changes outcomes from a climate perspective, but also changes outcomes from a social perspective. So we've seen things in the portfolio like the ADB issued a gender bond. We have a social bond in New Zealand focused on reducing recidivism among youth offenders. Obviously, there's lots of green bonds out there and increasing issuance in that, and green loans. But those things which are focused on changing the real world outcomes are really how investors like us and other asset owners and other investment managers can actually contribute to this coming out of this funk that we've been in with COVID, but also addressing some of those really big problems that we have as global citizens.
one of the challenges, one of the comments I hear from investors is that, oh yeah, this all sounds really nice and love to do that, but it's going to cost me. I'm not going to get those returns. And you can argue that, well, if you look at the long term, which is what investors should be doing, you are. But notwithstanding that, what's the message you get from your stakeholders, or what's the conversation you have with stakeholders around this journey, the implications for returns potentially?
Yeah, so we've seen a real increase in interest from our stakeholders, and our stakeholders are all New Zealand citizens, but also more narrowly Parliament. We appear before select committees and we talk to them about what we're doing, but also the media and other interest groups. We've seen a really significant increase over the last couple of years in what's the impact of some of our decisions, and who are we investing in and what are they doing? And we're very transparent about. We publish every 6 months. We publish a list of our portfolio companies, and anyone can go and have a look, and then they can identify companies that are doing stuff that they don't like. So we get a lot of that inbound inquiry. In terms of the sort of specifically on the does this cost me? Our climate change investment strategy has actually added value to our portfolio more than 50 basis points a year for the last 4 years, which is a not insignificant amount when you think actually what we've done is reduce our exposure to what we think is a misprice risk, in particular the risk of or the climate change risk and how that's represented in security prices. So that has actually benefited us through that time from a financial perspective, as well as I think reduced the risk of the portfolio. So, but the other thing for investors like us is we're going to be around for the long term. We're going to continue to grow through the end of this century. So for us, the time frame over which things like climate change is going to manifest, or the impact on biodiversity is going to manifest, or serious inequality around the world is going to manifest, is going to impact our returns over the long term. So we have to care about those things as we allocate our capital and make our investment decisions.
Look, thanks, Matt. I think we're sort of running out of time. What's the next step as we step out of COVID? What's the next thing that the super fund is going to attempt or try to do to go into this next phase that we've been talking about today?
Well, so given that we've just committed to that net zero commitment, we've got quite a lot of work to do in the next 12 months to produce the plan for getting to net zero by 2050 and detailing that. We've been reducing carbon intensity in our portfolio, but without a sort of a firm destination in mind. Now we've got one that we've signed up to, so we've got a lot of work to do on that. And the other bit is just increasing our exposure to that positive investment space. So we've been active in developing renewable generation, in particular in the US, but we're also looking at that in Europe. We're going to look at that also in New Zealand. But that positive investment space, I think, is one that's going to take quite a lot of our focus over the coming years as we think harder about how do we achieve additional outcomes from our investments while still generating the return that, frankly, New Zealanders need for us to do our ultimate job, which is smooth out the cost of universal pension in New Zealand.
That's great. Thank you, Matt. Hope those questions weren't too hard. I know it's performance appraisal time, so keep that in mind. But hope you get out, enjoy the sort of pre-summer day today, practice your social distancing, carry a mask in your pocket, and hope we see you in the office. Hope you get back into the office very soon.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone. Look forward to perhaps getting up there in person in Toronto in years to come.